Should you be stretching your hamstrings? Today we're going to take a look at why you need to stop stretching your hamstrings and the 5 moves you should be doing instead. Hey guys, it's Corey from Redefining Strength, and today I want to talk about why you need to stop stretching your hamstrings and 5 moves you need to do instead. But before I go into the 5 moves you should do instead, I want to talk about why I think that whole trying to touch your toes thing is kind of stupid. And I also want to tell you why stretching might not be the answer, why those feelings of tightness might not mean that you need to stretch more. So first off, why is trying to touch your toes kind of a stupid, pointless goal? Well, first off, trying to touch your toes might not actually stretch your hamstrings. You could simply round forward towards the ground and you won't even work your hamstrings or stretch your hamstrings at all, and therefore you're not actually testing your hamstring flexibility. Plus, if you tend to have monkey arms like me, even if you have long legs, you might be able to touch your toes, no problem, even if your hamstrings aren't flexible. So that whole trying to touch your toes, proving you're really flexible thing, it's just not really showing anything about your hamstring flexibility. So it's kind of a stupid test. If you really do want to be able to touch your toes though and work on your hamstring flexibility, you need to make sure that you're actually hinging at the hips. If you do choose to stretch your hamstrings, you need to make sure that you're hinging at your hips, so you're sitting your butt back and actually training that hip hinge movement pattern. Now, the other reason that I think stretching your hamstrings is really pointless is because tightness does not mean that a muscle is shortened. When we stretch, we're trying to lengthen a shortened muscle group, but often our hamstrings aren't actually shortened. So that tightness we feel might have to do with hip instability or even knee instability, and it might also have to do with the fact that the hamstrings are also overly lengthened. Think about a rubber band. The more you stretch it, the tighter it gets. The hamstrings are kind of the same way. Any muscle, when you overstretch it, can feel tight. So therefore, if you're stretching an overstretched muscle, you're not going to make it any better, and you might actually make the problem worse. So we want to make sure that we're returning the muscle to its proper length-tension relationship so that it doesn't feel tight. We want to correct the instability that's there so that that muscle isn't freaked out or even trying to work when it shouldn't. Ever heard of synergistic dominance? That's when a muscle works for the muscle that should be really working. So if we're doing a glute movement or a hip hinge movement, our hamstrings try and take over for our glutes because our glutes aren't firing effectively and efficiently. So we want to make sure that we're actually activating that underactive muscle so that our hamstrings aren't trying to take over. And that can help improve the stability of our hip joint and therefore prevent that feeling of tightness that we have. Again, we want to make sure that we're actually addressing the reason that the muscle feels tight and not simply stretching, assuming that the muscle is shortened. A lot of times, especially with our hamstrings, our hips are actually tight. We sit a lot, we spend all this time in flexion, and our hips become shortened, and that can then overly lengthen our hamstrings, making them feel tight, when in fact, we should be stretching our hip flexors. So what are 5 moves you should be doing to correct this problem instead of stretching your hamstrings? Move number 1 is actually addressing your hip flexor tightness. You want to foam roll your hip flexors. Especially the TFL can be a hip flexor you want to address with foam rolling. This can then help you activate your glutes better after, and it can make sure that you're not actually in that sort of hip flex state, stretching your hamstrings further. To foam roll your TFL, you want to either use a ball or a roller and you want to lay over it. You do not want to roll really quickly back and forth, but you actually want to hold on the muscle and allow it time to relax and release itself. We're trying to shut off that communication between that muscle and our brain so that we can activate the underactive muscles when those other muscles might want to tend to take over. So part of it is inhibiting that communication, that mind-body connection. So not only do we want to roll the TFL, but we actually want to roll our hamstrings. Especially if you tend to feel your hamstrings during glute bridges and some of those movements when your glutes should be the prime mover, you can use hamstring foam rolling to relax that overactive muscle and allow yourself to establish a better mind-body connection with your glutes. So foam rolling your hamstring by sitting on a bench with a ball underneath your butt can be really helpful. Again, you're not rolling quickly, you're holding on the muscle to help it relax and release itself. After you foam roll, you always want to stretch. And as I mentioned, a lot of times the reason our hamstrings can become overly lengthened is because our hip flexors are actually shortened and they're tight. So we want to start with a hip flexor stretch. If you're doing stretching before your workout, you want to focus on dynamic movements. So even a lunge with a straight back leg can be really good, or I love the off-bench hip flexor stretch. You're going to actually sink as if you're sinking into a deep lunge with this one, and you're going to squeeze your glute to really put that hip into extension. If we actually focus on the activation of our glutes during the hip flexor stretch, we can actually get a better release of that muscle. We're using a process called reciprocal inhibition. We're activating the opposing muscle group to inhibit the muscle group that is shortened and overactive. After you stretch, you then want to use activation. And again, you're sort of using reciprocal inhibition to activate your glutes and therefore relax your hip flexors. The one difficult thing with most glute activation moves is if we have that synergistic dominance going on, our hamstrings are going to want to take over during glute activation moves. So it's key that we try and put our body in a position where our hamstrings can't do that. That's why I really like the frog bridge. The external rotation of your hips and the fact that your knees are bent can really help you prevent your hamstrings from wanting to take over. However, if you do have piriformis issues, be careful with this movement and even focus on dialing in that basic glute bridge. I'll link to some great tips if you do have problems with the glute bridge and your lower back or hamstrings taking over. But the frog bridge can be a great way to work around it because of using that external rotation to help you engage your glutes. The last move I really think is key that you include is some form of an abduction exercise. You want to work that glute medius because it will improve your hip stability. And again, a lot of times the muscle can be tight because of instability at a joint. So if we improve our hip stability, we can get our hamstrings to relax and stop being as overactive. So we want to make sure to include movements that really target that glute medius. Plus, getting our glute medius to fire better can help improve the firing of our glute max. So you want to include abduction movements. I like the side lying lateral lift because you can put your hip into internal rotation, which not only can prevent your piriformis from overworking, but also prevent your TFL from compensating. When you do that internal rotation of your hip, you can really focus on the glute medius as the prime mover. You can also do a slight kick back if you really struggle to get your glute medius firing, and even to get your glute max firing a little bit too. So doing that lateral raise with those tweaks can really help you make sure that you're getting your glutes firing to help prevent your hamstrings from overworking. Using these 5 moves even daily to start, you can really help relax that feeling of tightness that you have with your hamstrings, and it can get you to stop stretching and actually feel the results that you truly want. Because while stretching might feel good temporarily, it's not a fix long term. You want to correct the instability that's there and make sure that you're also not allowing the muscle to be overly lengthened because other muscles are shortened. If you liked the video, make sure to like it, comment below if you have any questions, and subscribe. We're posting new videos each week.